Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Our guest today is David M. Perry, who is currently the Associate Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of History at the University of Minnesota. Anyone, however, who knows anything about either of us will know that the two of us are longtime friends and co-authors. We've written pieces for CNN, MSNBC, and The Washington Post, among others. But also we write books. The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe, and most recently, Oathbreakers, The War of Brothers that Shattered an Empire and Made Medieval Europe. Both available wherever fine books, ebooks, and audiobooks are sold. And it's actually Oathbreakers that we're going to be mostly talking about today. Welcome, David.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure, and thank you so much for joining us here. You know, one of the questions that I always kind of wonder about when I'm talking to fellow historians or people who are interested in the Middle Ages is about time machines. And what I mean is that, like, all historians have kind of a complicated relationship with time machines, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for the moment, if you don't mind, let's pretend that you have one.
Okay.
And you can go back and tell childhood David Perry that you are a medievalist nowadays, in the present. How does childhood David Perry react to that news?
You know, I think he's pretty excited because he's a nerd and he's reading Tolkien and he's playing Dungeons & Dragons. Actually, he's not even playing Dungeons & Dragons. His older brother is playing Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah.
And he really wants to play too. And part of what I think is so interesting about having become a medievalist is the ways in which sort of that nerd child and then teenager still exists within me, but also all of the things that I thought about the Middle Ages in some ways I have taken apart in the work of becoming an actual scholar, and that I've really changed. I think he'd be pretty excited, but then I want to tell him, but great, but listen, you're not playing D&D all day. You're not, go study your Latin, right? And then start Arabic as soon as possible. You know, that these ideas that carry me into the study of the past, study of the medieval past in particular, are not the ideas that have sustained me over the past 30 years, which is a lot of years. And I think that's interesting, in part because I think about that point of entry for me and my students or our readers or anything. Like, they're often in that point of entry, and it's a genuine, authentic, excited one that is based on really not understanding a lot, or understanding some things really well and then not understanding other things, but not knowing even what you don't know yet.
Yeah, and it's super interesting too. I mean, that kind of fantasy or high fantasy kind of entryway is very common, right, when you talk to kind of colleagues. But at the same time, like, it doesn't go away. Like, I think there are things that sometimes will get you interested in a particular topic that, you know, you kind of learn a little bit more about the period and you're like, oh, that was kind of a silly way of thinking about this. But I don't think that's true, right, with kind of high fantasy. Like, the more that I learned about Tolkien and Lewis and stuff like that they were actually medievalists, that they were basing their world building on different versions of the Middle Ages, like, actually just got me more interested in this topic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you know, I remember, because I was teaching it, it was not when I was a student. The first time I sat down and read, I think it's the Lay of Rig, which is, I think Icelandic. I could be wrong. Apologies to the Nordic scholars out there. I think it's an Icelandic poem, but it's a really interesting poem. But there is one point where, like, the names of the dwarves are being recited. And of course, they're all the names from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. That didn't make me think, Tolkien, you have no imagination. It made me think, that's really cool. Tolkien also read this exact poem, probably in the original, and then drew from it. And then then remembering, well, I had read as a teenager the Norse myths of Andvari and the Golden Ring, and then all the different sort of permutations of it in like a Norse mythology for nerdy teenager book or nerdy middle grade readers books. And then I went and read, medieval translations because someone asked me to teach the Vikings and I never taught the Vikings. So I had to do a lot of reading. And again, that just made me like those fantasy things more. I think you can be both critical and still enjoy these things. And that honestly, as an academic, you have to be critical. You can't put that aside, but that doesn't mean that you have to say, well, that was, when I was young, I like childish things, but I've got to put them away. I can't quote the Bible for you, but you don't have to put them away. You get to kind of carry them with you, but with a different kind of lens.
Yeah, and I think that there's often a misconception, right, about academics kind of generally, but medievalists, I think, kind of suffer from this a little bit more, maybe, is that there's a perception that it's kind of a fandom culture that kind of gets you into that, and that does exist, of course, right? But at the same time, I think that it's much more a critical engagement. Like, it's understanding, for example, like, I mean, Tolkien can be, really interesting, but like kind of problematic in a lot of different ways, and understanding the ways in which he was thinking about the Middle Ages and constructing his world from a particular standpoint of a mid-century English gentleman at Oxford.
Yeah.
Right. One of the things that I think, though, that really unites kind of historians generally, and I like to think unites us specifically, is that we are also big fans of just good stories. And one of the really good stories that we have told, I think, recently is a book by the name of Oathbreakers. Which, do you want to talk a little bit about? It feels so stilted to ask this question because, we wrote this book together, but I feel like I have to give the guests the pride of place here in talking about it first.
Well, I'm happy to introduce it because it really came out of the mind of my good friend Matt, who...
that guy sounds great.
He's great. So one of the things I suspect most medievalists encounter, and maybe all historians encounter, but certainly anyone who works on something that is in the more remote past, but also is just a lot of years. So we work on 1,000 years of history, give or take, which is a lot of years, whereas most Americanists do not. And even people who work, the people who really have it even worse are like the people who work in deep antiquity, like, the 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Someone says, well, I'll tell you about King Tut. And that's 1,500 years after my period, right? Yeah. Medievalists don't have it quite that bad, but pretty bad. So, I really came into the Middle Ages as a later medievalist, as an Italianist, as someone interested in the city of Venice. I'm still interested in the city of Venice. And really my deep learning about even just the medieval Mediterranean kind of starts maybe in sort of 1050s, 1070s, then the Venetian involvement in the First Crusade and the aftermath, and all of these things going forward. And while, of course, I had to teach, honestly, from that deep antiquity all the way, I like to say from Plato to NATO, but it's actually bigger than that in terms of what we have to teach, I was not deeply familiar with the 9th century. And so I start collaborating with you as an expert in the 9th century, and you're just telling me these stories, again, these great stories about things happening in the 9th century. You start telling them to me in the context. We wrote a book on that whole 1,000 years and trying to figure out which stories we were going to tell in our book, The Bright Ages. And you keeping on returning to the 9th century and talking about not just these guys doing these mostly stupid and violent things.
There are a lot of stupid and violent things in the book, yes.
And not just the collapse of empire, although that's part of the story too, and how we're going to work that into our chapter. We get one chapter on the Carolingians. What are we going to put into it? All of these discussions trying to be intentional and smart about picking these stories. But also the ways in which people in the 9th century made sense of their world and talked about their world. And that's really... I'd be happy to sit down and write a book about any cool civil war because I know readers like cool civil wars and you can always do interesting things talking about, armies on the field. But neither of us is really a military historian. Neither of us is really someone, and I love military historians. I learn a lot from them. But that's not really what you and I do, is we're interested in how people in their own time frame understood their world and made sense of their world and made arguments about their world, and then how the people who, if I may, I think it's both of us, how the people who then followed them, not just, but also all the way through to today, made sense of what happened. So how did 11th century people make sense of the 9th century? How do we make sense of the 9th century? How did the 19th century historians make sense of the 9th century? And this constantly kind of iterative process of a thing happens, people respond to it, people make sense of it in their time frame, and then that process continues forever. And you can study how that process continues forever. And the way that we understand it today is not how, assuming people are studying the 9th century in the year 2700 from Mars, they're going to have a different set of things. And that's exciting to me.
Yeah.
So the book is about, people generally know about Charlemagne. He's probably one of the top 3 or 4 people that even in the English-speaking world, you've heard of from the Middle Ages. And I would expect that listeners to this podcast over time will get to know Charlemagne pretty well, just as a guess.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Charlemagne had a one surviving son, Louis, known as Louis the Pious. He inherited the whole thing, though not without some complications. Louis, however, when he died, had 3 surviving sons, and they fought a brutal civil war for a number of years and ended up beginning the process that really broke the empire into multiple pieces. They didn't know they were doing this. Even when they signed a peace treaty, they didn't know they were drawing lines on the map that in some ways would have a long-lasting impact on the shape of medieval Europe and arguably through to today. But that is what happened in ways that are important and interesting, and that, again, folks tried to make sense of at the time and continue to try to make sense of today, and we're part of that story.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the kind of fascinating things that I learned kind of along the way when I was doing the work, and I think it really comes out in Oathbreakers, and in an unexpected way, I should say, as we were working on Oathbreakers, is the way that people seem to make sense of the world was not just through writing, but through the things they did. Like as we were charting the history of the Civil War, the machinations of the sons of Louis the Pious and stuff like that, you could tell like Lothar really cared about empire, not just because of the text he was creating in his entourage, but the way that he was trying to go about restoring the empire of his father and taking control. It has kind of real world implications, right? Like I think we tend to think of meaning making as this dry affair, but what Oathbreakers really tries to do is to show no, people live this stuff. And in a lot of cases, it led to a lot of people being killed, and a lot of people suffering in those ways.
Yeah, it's easy to be cynical.
Sure.
And it's also easy to say, well, he really believed it, and make that sound kind of exculpatory.
Yeah.
We've both, I think, run into this a lot when talking about the history of the Crusades, where there's a certain argument that because the people who fought the Crusades really believed it, it's sort of okay. And I do think they really believed it. I don't think that makes it okay. But, there are other people who think they didn't. It was all cynical. It was all just sort of, class warfare.
Yeah.
I think understanding Lothar is not just making a naked grab to hold on to power, though he is also interested in his own power, but that he has this fundamental belief of how the empire is supposed to look and his role in it at the top, and is just not willing to let that go at great cost. And of course, one of the things about Lothar, which again, I didn't really know until I started writing this book with you, is that we don't really have his story.
No.
That our major sources come from, and I think this is mostly, though you could correct me, I think this is mostly just chance in terms of chance survival. But we have one major monastic source and we have one major history. And the history comes from Charles the Bald, the youngest of the brother. And the monastic source is definitely pro-Louis the German, the middle brother. And while we have lots and lots of text that is Lotharian, that is in his camp, we don't have a good source that starts at the beginning and proceeds chronologically, let alone someone like this history. So Lothar's voice is a little muted, despite being empire, is a little muted, and the voices of people criticizing him are really loud. And I think that's something that we had to work with in our book, is to make sure that Lothar, who is obviously extremely important in this narrative, despite the fact that he's very present in the sources until the Civil War. But during the Civil War, we just, at least I don't have a sense that there's a really good narrative source that presents sort of his point of view. There are problematic ones like this weird bishop from Ravenna who goes on the war and comes back, but his history is written by someone who hates him. Yeah. It's like extra double removed and complicated. So we just don't have that. That makes it challenging.
Yeah. Going back to something you earlier said, I think it's really important in any kind of study of the past to understand the difference between exculpatory and explanatory.
Yeah.
Right. Just because you understand something doesn't mean that, it kind of justifies that. Like, there are lots of terrible things that people have done throughout history that we can understand and we need to understand. But that doesn't mean that they could kind of get a free pass. There's always that terrible, well, they're just products of the time. It's like,
right.
Boss, there are lots of other people who were products of the time that did not do those terrible things. So we don't have to go down that road. But going back to the problem of the sources, and especially Lothar, because you're right. Like, I did not expect this as we were going along, but like I became very sympathetic to Lothar in ways that I had always been kind of, throughout, as you said, like several decades studying this period, kind of very anti-Lothar. He seemed like kind of the bratty older brother who just kind of wanted to get his way. And then I realized, especially as we were writing this, with some other stuff kind of shortly before this that I was working on kind of from the academic side, that the sources are kind of telling us a particular type of story about this guy. And like you said, we don't really have his view. One of the problems we talk about throughout the book that Lothar runs into is that alliances keep shifting. Like
Yeah.
some of them because of the actions that he takes, but during the period of civil war, which really starts in the 830s and then continues into the 840s when the brothers actually start fighting with one another, is that a lot of people just are switching sides. So Rabanus Maurus, for example, who's one of the kind of this monastic chronicler, becomes Archbishop of Mainz and stuff like that, like a partisan of Lothar at times, but then ultimately ends up in the camp of Louis the German. So if he was going to create something that was pro-Lothar, like he kind of missed his chance, and then, he kind of had to change his tune because he kind of switched sides later on.
Yeah.
The other kind of big things that seems like Lothar should win, like the 833 deposition of his father, where all the brothers come together, Lothar, the eldest, at the head. They literally force Louis to enter a monastery, though he doesn't become a monk, and that's important. Make this kind of public confession. All the bishops are around him. Lothar becomes the sole emperor, but then he loses. Yeah. Right. And so, any sort of kind of accommodation of Lothar's point of view just kind of disappears kind of very quickly. And it's all these little kind of set pieces, which you see how kind of they could turn on a dime. And I hope that we're able to do an Oathbreakers to show like all these little moments in which people make decisions, and they could have made other decisions, kind of really change the way that history proceeds, not just for the 9th century, but, for centuries afterwards as well.
It's not hard to imagine Lothar putting his dad in a monastery and keeping him there. It's not hard to have Louis decide, well, I'm getting older anyway. I mean, he's going to be dead within 7 years, not in a terribly old age, but was he probably in his early 50s or late? I mean, but early 50s when he's in the monastery. Maybe.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
But I mean, I'm 52. I'm willing to go to a monastery and have things be a little quiet.
Oh, I think about retirement all the time.
Yeah. So can't afford it, but I imagine. So, I can imagine him staying there. I can even imagine Lothar or someone, having him killed. It's not likely. And I think the reasons that doesn't happen are sort of that people actually believe in the emperor and king and don't want to kill their dad. Just, this is not Game of Thrones, even though we bill it as a real life Game of Thrones. But in Game of Thrones, he just has him killed, or he doesn't, and that's the tragic flaw. But I think the more real is that you just sort of, he's not ready to do that. That's just not something that you do.
Yeah, nephews, you can kill any nephew you want.
That's
totally
or at least
fine,
blind them, and then if they die, they die. But you're not supposed to kill your dad, and that's real, and that has a consequence.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
It's also, there are all these moments where he was close to winning, or at least close to, if not winning, at least close to really establishing his dominance in a way that would likely have lasted much longer. We talk about this one battle, which I really like, in part because it's very dramatic, and we have a couple of dramatic sources, though not particularly reliable ones. Mm-hmm. But we know that it took place crossing a river in a meteor crater in what is today Germany. And there's this, it's the only meteor crater like this on Earth. I really can't tell you more about it, although I have a good footnote in the book and you can read more about the geology here. There are meteor craters like this on Mars and on the moon, I think, but there's only one of these particular kinds of craters. If you know, there's a precious stone called moldavite, which is very pretty, this fused stone. That happened because of the meteor crater like 1,000 miles away. But meteor craters are really big, and they permanently transform the shape of the Earth in a way that today you can go to this place, Nordlinger Race, and you won't be able to see the meteor crater because it's really big, but you can look at a map.
You'll be in the meteor
You'll
crater.
be in it. You can look at a map, right? But it creates a totally different topography. It creates all these different rivers and hills and forests and difficult terrain. And one of Lothar's big armies, not with him, but with one of his major generals, makes a mistake, gets caught crossing the river and gets defeated by Louis's much smaller army. And the whole military history of the Civil War unfolds differently because of this mistake. Yeah. And it isn't just like a tactical mistake where, we should have waited an hour to cross the river or not cross the river. That army shouldn't have even been there, right? It should have just stayed well away and just kept Louis's army separate. And so these kinds of people making decisions really change the shape of the war in ways that you can kind of see, but also like, we don't have a diary of that general. We don't know what he was thinking. Yeah. I was just reading a really fun book on submarine warfare and submarine spying in the 20th century. Okay. Really fun. The historian went and talked to these naval officers and read their reports and read their letters home.
Oh, to be able to do that as a medievalist, yeah.
Right. I have an ancestor who fought and died in the Civil War. His letters are literally sitting in my study right now in a nice wooden box, and I have read them, and I know what was going on in his head.
Yeah.
Part of being a medievalist is that we almost never have that. And when we do get things like that, it is a random survival that can really distort our understanding of the past because we have only this one guy or woman in a very important case.
Absolutely.
In Duoda's case, right? We have this one source that then we have to shape our whole understanding around. And I love that as a medievalist. I think you have to be humble. I think you have to say, here is what this source enables us to say, but to always be open to the idea that we're going to learn more and have to rewrite our narratives. And that's exciting rather than a problem.
Yeah, that humility, I think, is really critically important, especially because, like, the set piece that you're describing, which, I don't want to give away too much, right, about the book, because everybody should go buy the book, and that would make, I think, both of us quite happy if you were to do so. Paperback comes out very soon, in fact. But that moment at the crater, at the Nordlinger Ries, which is immediately preceded, one big battle that is immediately precedes another huge battle, kind of really the centerpiece of the book itself, this Battle of Fontenoy, when the three brothers kind of fight all together at the same point. Like, it has a longer history too, and it's so important to remember the humanity of the people who were involved, because it's not just that this bigger army, which on Lothar's side, like, fails to contain Louis the German from meeting up with Charles the Bald. It's because the commander of that army and Louis the German had such animosity and hatred for one another going back like more than a decade that probably almost certainly played a role in both Louis the German's kind of audacity in making the move against this larger army, but also kind of the ambition of this larger army to take an ultimately failed risk and try to cross this river and get ambushed at that time. Because, like, these guys just hated each other. Like, they just hated each other. And this is one of those moments where we actually do have some documentation, and we are fortunate in our book, which we are very, very clear about, I think, standing on the shoulders of so much great scholarship that has come before us, that has excavated these sources and kind of unearthed these relationships, is that these guys had been kind of plotting and scheming at their father's court for decades beforehand, and had this one nobleman had alienated Louis the German from his father, leading Louis the German to spend the last 5 years of his life in revolt against his father, of ultimately bringing Lothar back in the fold from exile. Like, it's a hugely complicated mess. And it's also one of the reasons that I think it's incredibly important that you had the great idea to include a cast of characters at the beginning of the book, because, like, they're all named like Louis, Pepin, and, Charles. But there's lots of kind of really interesting characters that keep showing up all the time. So, but I do want to talk about Fontenoy a little bit.
Absolutely.
One of the things you mentioned kind of earlier is that, we're not military historians, and I think that's absolutely fair. But one of the really cool things about military history nowadays is it's not the kind of stale movement of armies that I think a lot of people imagine when they say military history, because it is a lot now of politics and culture and issues of gender and things of that nature. And I think you see that kind of all on display at Fontenoy. We interrupt these Middle Ages to take you to space. Pale Blue Pod is a sister show on Multitude, an astronomy podcast for people who are overwhelmed by the universe but want to be its friend. Hosted by astrophysicist Dr. Moya McTeer and her best friend Constar, together they demystify space one topic at a time. Hopefully, by the end of each episode, the cosmos will be a little less scary and a lot more freaking cool. New episodes drop every Monday. Who's ready for hot Jupiter winter? You definitely are, so check the show out. Now, back to American Medieval.
Yeah, and again, both of us, to some extent, were part of one of the things that I expect you'll end up talking on this podcast, right, is the evolution of the field of medieval studies, medieval history specifically, but medieval studies more broadly. How we study the past changes generation to generation. Doesn't mean it gets better, but different generations of scholars start asking different questions, in part because of the answers to questions that previous generations developed. And so both of us really came into the profession with the word crusade showing up in our publications, but not doing the kind of scholarship on the Crusades that our advisors did, or certainly their advisors did, that the people that we read about the Crusades in grad school, we were asking different kinds of questions, but they're questions that take place in a military context. And you have to, for me, my scholarly work was on the Fourth Crusade, which we will talk about on another podcast. But at the end of the Fourth Crusade, the city of Constantinople gets looted of relics. And I had to build a very careful timeline of sort of the movement of people and stuff and the looting of a city in a way that was straight narrative history. I mean, I just had to do it because you can't do the other things. And then the same thing happens with Fontenoy. To the extent possible, we had to figure out troop movements and army sizes and equipment and strategy.
Topography.
And topography, yeah. I mean, and, there's a brook that I think plays an important role. There's the equipment of Louis the German that we were just talking about, that he and his smaller army looted off the bigger army so that they arrived on the field tired, but very well equipped, probably the best equipped force from, the top of the army to the bottom of the army of any force on the field. And it's not a coincidence that then Louis went straight up against Lothar's own forces there. These kinds of things. And then once we know that, we can start talking about the next level of questions of faith and culture and meaning and identity and masculinity in these cases, sort of, and what it means to be a brother. Why I think often the brothers didn't pursue each other to the death, even though that would be a smart military strategy, but or they didn't execute their dad when they had him in their control. These kinds of questions that I think reveal important, deeper meaning and also allow us to tell more sort of character-driven stories. You have to do a lot of work to build a foundation before you can start even asking those questions.
Yeah, because there's a critical moment, right? So at Fontenoy, when the brothers are facing off, so it's the youngest brothers, Charles the Bald, who's the absolute youngest, and Louis the German against their elder brother Lothar and their nephew, this guy Pepin II of Aquitaine. But there's another player on the field too, right? This guy Bernard of Septimania, who has a large army. Bernard is like the big villain of our books, I guess spoiler alert, but you'll learn to hate Bernard if you're listening to this soon enough.
He's the bad penny that keeps turning up at the very least.
He just keeps turning up, man. They can't get rid of that guy.
And never in a way that's helpful. Never he turns up and it's never helpful. Ever. Not even to his friends.
Dude just every time he tries to help, he just kind of makes everything kind of worse. And I don't know, part of me thinks he's just kind of malicious, but also part of it's I think he just has a lot of kind of bad luck, and he's blamed for things that aren't actually his fault. When he's first brought in, sorry, we're taking a little bit of a tangent, but it's a podcast. This is what we're doing. We're talking. So, when he first turns up at Louis the Pious's court, it's Louis the Pious who actually screws everything up by bringing this guy in. It's not his fault necessarily. I think Bernard had a little bit of a role to play in kind of elevating himself at some of his rivals' expense, but later on, absolutely, Bernard just doesn't bring his army into battle at Fontenoy. And he's commanding a sizable force, almost certainly, could probably, and Fontenoy turns on a dime for Louis the German and Charles the Bald. They end up the victors. And what would happen, if that army could have showed up? Bernard made a choice. He could have chosen otherwise. And that's one of those really interesting questions. But about relationships too, is that as the battle is ending, one of the things we talk about too is that there is a bloody pursuit, but just in that moment, right?
Yeah.
Louis the German and Charles the Bald are pursuing their brother's army. They decide not to continue with the pursuit, but there is absolutely a massacre of Lothar and Pepin's forces in the immediate aftermath, and they decide not to continue it, right? And I think that's a really important moment because it could have ended right there, but there's lots of reasons why the Civil War needed to continue, and Charles and Louis made the decision they did.
Yeah, and again, it just speaks to the complexity of these people and the ways in which a lot of understanding of medieval violence is wrong. And battle, probably over all time, but I'm just going to speak in this instead of what I know, that, battle is terrible, but maybe a little less lethal than we expected, that, armor works and wounds can be tended, not that well, but they can be tended, and shields can deflect arrows, and that a lot of people survive these battles even on the losing side normally, unless as the army breaks, the other side just tries to keep chasing them down and killing as they go and not taking prisoners. That really only happens once in this Civil War in the battles that we follow. There are a couple of ambushes that have a very high body count, including this attack in the crater.
River crossings.
Ambushes can be horrifically violent, of course. But that when armies meet, as one retreats, the other army doesn't pursue. And they don't pursue sometimes. They tend not to. They don't pursue for tactical reasons. It's easy to have the big strategy for Carolingian armies is to fake a retreat and then to surround them.
Yeah.
They have many strategies, but that is like a really standard, it's like, do you rush the passer or not? It's like the big strategy.
That's right.
And it's talked about in military manuals. We have a scene of a war game where they're practicing, and that's the strategy they're practicing. So it's the big strategy.
This is a podcast called American Medieval, so I think the football analogies are perfectly fine in this context. Yeah.
There you go. I mean, it's just like, when the other side runs away, you want to make sure they're really running away, or you might be running away in a minute.
Yeah.
But moreover, like, pursuing your enemy to the death, particularly when they are fellow Franks, when they're fellow members of this empire, this imperial project, it's just not what you do. And so even when they do it a little bit, they quickly pull back, and it's quite clear, feel remorse, certainly feel that they have to perform remorse and say, hey, we have violated some norms here. We need to address this. We can't just say, kill them all. And let God sort it out. We have to say, we killed a lot of them, and now we need to talk to God and really perform this kind of remorse in a way that I think matters. And I think it matters as a political act. But I really do think it matters to them, too, that they understand they've done something that has transgressed things that they themselves believe in, and they have to figure out how to make sense of that.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency, right, in popular conceptions of the Middle Ages to kind of, like you just used that phrase, right, kill them all, God will sort them out, which is a famous phrase. It comes from the early 13th century. It has to do with the Albigensian Crusade.
That's my century.
That is your century indeed. So now I'm treading on unfamiliar ground here.
That's right.
But at the same time, right, it's like that was a radical statement in its own right, which ends up being justified and used, throughout the 13th and later centuries. But it's certainly not present here in the period that we're talking about in the 9th century, when you have a civil war, not just between brothers who are at the leadership, but another thing, again, like one of the reasons Bernard keeps showing up like a bad penny, all these guys have kind of long histories, is because they know each other intimately. Like they have been in social, cultural, political circles, intermarrying with one another sometimes for many decades, not just in this generation, but in previous generations as well. And so the idea of A, killing them, or B, kind of pursuing them, with massacre in your mind, that is kind of a radical act. We make a very brief analogy, but the thing that always kind of, and maybe it's because I grew up with a mom who was an American history teacher, talking about the Civil War and visiting American Civil War battlefields all the time, is that kind of attitude, right? Like the first battle of Manassas, the first battle of Bull Run, like when the armies finally come to blows and kind of the intellectual shock that comes with it, not just during the battle, but most especially in the aftermath.
Yeah.
Right. Because a lot of what we end up talking about for the second half of the book is people processing the trauma of Fontenoy.
Yeah. Yeah. They come across, I think, as people.
They do. It's weird. People existed in the past.
Yeah. But they are people. And, we certainly don't in the book. And I generally try to avoid like using phrases like PTSD, because PTSD has kind of a specific meaning, but also I think it's entirely PTSD. I think there's a lot of PTSD going around. I think there's definitely ongoing trauma responses in ways that inform decisions and behaviors, both rationally but often irrationally, for years afterwards. And that, societies figure out ways of processing trauma more or less healthily, and that we see them trying to process trauma by doing such things as writing poetry or having a public ritual or other things that may seem a little strange, but, maybe actually writing poetry is not so strange as a process of trauma. We see that a lot in the history of warfare. We actually open our book with a poem about trauma. Again, that's not something, I don't want to do sort of amateur psychology hour on these guys, but I do think we can see the trauma coming through these texts. And then we have to engage it and not pretend it's all just, fake or all just ritual or all just politics.
Yeah, no, I think, any sort of writing is performative in a very kind of superficial sense, at least, right? But at the same time, like you can see that this stuff matters, right? The reason that this was written at this particular time, that poem that was written probably very shortly after the Battle of Fontenoy that you were talking about earlier, right? I mean, that guy's going through some stuff.
Right.
Right. Another great source that we use consistently is this guy by the name of Nithard, who is one of Charlemagne's grandsons as well. He's an illegitimate grandson of Charlemagne, but is in the entourage of Charles the Bald, the youngest of the kings of the brothers, and writes a history at the command of his cousin, Charles the Bald. And like it turns, man, after Fontenoy, like it is a different tone. Like he is not a happy dude, and he is bitter and alienated and just going through some stuff.
Yeah. I was trying to think, even just now, but also while we were working on it, like you, I have read a lot of histories, medieval, but also beyond. And I'm sure there are some others, but I can't remember one I've read that says, okay, we reached the big battle. He sort of rushes through it. Clearly he didn't want to write about it.
Yeah.
He writes
super
really
quick.
He's got in the printed edition, 4 or 5 pages on these minor sort of events. And then he gets to the big battle in which he fought. And it's a page.
Yeah.
And it's brief. And he says,
Yeah.
by the way, there are 3 wings of the army and I was in this 3rd one. And yeah, we fought 2. Now next, the history's over. And he just says, history is over. Now, this is book 2 of 4. So the history's not over. And then he begins the next one with saying, well, I guess I got to keep writing because, there's been a whole thing afterwards and I got to go right back to, I just can't quite remember someone saying, and now my history is drawn to a close. Next page. Well, I guess not. And jumping forward. And it does feel authentic to me. And it partially feels authentic to me because Carolingians have worked very hard on this source. It's such an important source. So I get to read the scholars who really know this material, like Courtney Booker is one. There are many others, but people who have really spent decades working with this source in particular, it just feels authentic. He's upset by what happened. He has to finish the history. He says the end and he's done. But then he still lives in the world and he's still traveling with Charles' entourage and stuff keeps happening and people keep saying things. And so he has to get back into it again and keep writing. It's amazing. I mean, it's an amazing moment for me, like the history of writing history, let alone just in our story.
Yeah, and it is a shame. I mean, that kind of source is not better known, even among medievalists, but certainly among people who teach kind of methods and theories of history as well, because there is a way in which it's so that text Nithard's history, which is available in English translation. You could probably even just find, it online somewhere, but it's, little paperback if you wanted to get it, is that it's so learned in so many different ways. Like it understands classical history. There's lots of allusions to classical historical texts about military history and things like that. It alludes to other sorts of Carolingian sources, including biblical commentaries and things of that nature. But then it's also like really personal in a very interesting way that a lot of sources kind of aren't. Like you said, is because that transition moment when he decides he needs to pick it up again, like he centers himself. Is like, I have heard these wrong things about what has happened and what that battle meant. And that has forced me against my will to do this.
Yeah.
And then later on, it gets even worse. Like book 4 of the 4 books of the histories, right? Like it's very short. And it's basically like, that guy Charles that I worked for and he's my cousin and my king, that guy fucking sucks. And here's all the reasons why.
That's right.
He has hired this new guy and he's an advisor and he got married to this woman and this woman sucks. And remember my grandfather, Charlemagne, that was awesome. But now God is mad at us and we're all gonna die. The end.
Literally. Like,
that's how it ends.
Yeah. It's incredible.
Yeah.
I had definitely read excerpts of it in various contexts. I might have even taught excerpts of it in various contexts, but I had never sat down as a medievalist and read it from cover to cover. And I had for other Carolingian sources, right? I had read the famous Lives of Charlemagne cover to cover, every bit of them, read about them. There are other Carolingian sources I had engaged. I certainly had used Carolingian legal texts in teaching, and I had just never really read that source from cover to cover. And all you historians out there, go read Nithard. It's worth your time. It's really worth your time.
Yeah. And students love it. Like when I've taught it, like I think that's really interesting. Like people are just like, I think they're taught, and I think we are, as historians, kind of internalized too, kind of by the tradition of historiography, is that if a source seems dispassionate, it's quote unquote more trustworthy.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we endeavor to prove both in the Bright Ages, but also in Oathbreakers, is like, that's not true, man. Like, these things are like literary constructions in every way. So one of the other kind of major sources of the 9th century is this genre called an annal, which is literally just like they list a year and then some events that happen kind of afterwards. And it seems very dispassionate and kind of objective in its reporting. It's absolutely not, both in the presentation of the materials, but also in the selection of the events that they choose to record. And we're fortunate, as we kind of point out, is that, for example, in the period of the Civil Wars, we have an annal from East Francia under Louis the German, and we have an annal from West Francia under Charles the Bald. And like, they're allies for a time, but then they're not allies for a long time. And you could very clearly see the representation of different events coming off very, very differently in these sources.
Absolutely. And that's, to me, one of the things that you and I really try to do in our sort of popular writing, and we don't use popular as a pejorative, which plenty of academics still do, despite everything. But
all historians write for publics.
That's right.
Is just a simply true statement.
Yeah. So our experience in talking to readers who are not medievalists and are not historians, but are still the sub-selected group of people who want to pick up a history book, so that's not sadly everybody, but it's a lot of people, is they love this stuff. They love learning about these different sources and how historians know what we know, and even the limits of what we know. That's not a problem. There's this really amazing moment in which Louis the middle son is clearly the favored son at the moment. It's late in Louis the Pious's life. Louis the German is ascendant. There's all these people writing Louis and his namesake Louis. This is the future of the empire. It's going to be Louis followed by Louis. Sometimes it's hard, particularly if you're looking at them in Latin. It can be really tricky to figure out which Louis they're talking about. In modern editions, someone else has already done that work, and so they put a footnote to let you know.
Yeah.
But like, it's on purpose. They like to blur the Louis together to make them seem almost like one person. And it's not hard. If Louis the Pious had, fallen off his horse and hit his head and died in that particular moment in 836 or something, Louis the German was ready. He was ready to jump in and take over. Then there's this council or assembly. There's, sort of a formal court event, which seems like it's going to be the moment in which Louis the German is sort of formally acknowledged as the successor.
Yep, absolutely.
Something happens, probably with the machinations of these other guys, and Louis Adelhard, right? And Louis leaves disgraced, launches a revolt, spends the next 5 years in revolt. We don't know what happened. We don't even have like a biased source that reveals what happened in conversation between the two Louis. We have nothing. At least I'm not aware of anything. We got nothing.
Yeah.
That's fine. Like, a mystery of we got nothing, as long as you can frame it and here's all the stuff we do have. I'm always very excited as a medievalist when I say, here is an empty space. I'm going to build all the frame around it that I can, but that puzzle piece, it fell into the sink and we turned on the garbage disposal. It's gone. We just don't have it.
Yeah.
That's fun. To me, that's fun, the not knowing. And that's happens all the time as a medievalist. And I think it's part of the work of being medievalist is to have these empty spaces and to try to tell stories around them in ways that can make as much sense as possible.
Yeah. And that goes back to, something we were talking about at the beginning, right? Is about the humility that you need as a historian. Right. And one humble thing that I will say is that it's Adelbert, not Adelhard.
There you go.
So historians make mistakes sometimes.
Don't edit that out. That's okay. Important.
I'm not going to edit that out. I am fine with my foibles, some more than others, but that's a whole different kind of podcast. We don't need to go into that right now. Anyway, but the humility before the sources and those blank spaces. And as long as you are okay with saying, like, listen, we're just not going to know.
Yeah.
Like, this is the best we can do. This is how we arrived at the conclusions we did. But this is all we can tell you is something happens. We don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But here we are. And there's unfortunately lots of those kind of moments, not just in, medieval studies, but I think, kind of that's the work of thinking about the past, is because even when people, you have a diary, again, like we were talking about earlier, and they kind of are quote unquote revealing their innermost secrets, like they're still aware, like it's a presentation of themselves. And so, you have to take that with a little bit of grain of salt. I will say though, and this maybe brings us full circle back to the time machine question. If I had a time machine, the first thing I would do with the time machine is I would destroy the time machine because I don't really want to go back to the past. But if I had to, if somebody forced me into that and made me pick a date, that assembly, I think it's at Nijmegen in
Yeah.
the Netherlands, in which it seems like, like Louis the German is ascendant and something just absolutely catastrophic happens that leads to this falling out between Louis the Pious and Louis the German, is the father and middle son. So much so that multiple sources replied. We talk about this in the book. Louis the Pious on his deathbed, his bishops are around him saying, like, do you have any unfinished business? Like, you should forgive your son who's been in rebellion. And Louis the Pious is like, no.
Yeah.
Like, I hope he learns his lesson and is happy his dad is dead, basically. Like, so something happened there, man. And it's like, and a really like deep, and again, like a deeply personal, incredibly human way. This wasn't just politics. This was like,
No.
They did something. Somebody said something there, which just was absolutely unforgivable and just like caused a rift and destroyed, the Carolingian harmony, and in some ways led to a civil war, right?
But it doesn't mean that it was super dramatic or violent or something.
No.
My grandmother stopped talking to me for like 20 years because I went to New York to visit a friend and said I could also drop by and see you. And she thought that was just so offensive that she stopped talking. She was a complicated woman because I was supposed to go to New York to see her. And I said it the other way around. So she stopped talking to me for like 20 years. So it could be petty.
These are the most relatable kinds of family politics.
That's right.
If somebody says something and the other person just doesn't forget them for generations, right? So, That is absolutely probably the most relatable thing I can think of. We are kind of reaching towards the end of our time, unfortunately, but not only do you and I write books together, but sometimes we work on things on our own. So what are you working on right now?
I have a book coming out next April called The Public Scholar, a practical handbook from Johns Hopkins. It is intended for anyone who might consider themselves kind of an expert, or someone who, it's a loaded term, but someone who's really studied something who wants to communicate it to broader public. There's a lot of people who talk about why, in particular, academics should reach out and do public work, and I love that stuff. I'm really trying to talk about how you and I have ended up here on this podcast, how you and I have ended up writing these popular books, how you and I, which really starts with us writing short pieces together for the Washington Post and other kinds of, you at Forbes, me at CNN, how to do that, because it is not a secret, but it is a certain set of skills, and I have written down what those are. And so that's exciting. And then I'm writing a book about men.
I've heard about men.
It really starts with the Paleolithic, but it gets going with Gilgamesh, and it goes from Gilgamesh to me, not because we're equivalent, but because I'm trying to think as a historian why I'm so fucked up and interesting and totally not interesting, very predictable kinds of ways. How ideas about being a man, they differ in aspect over thousands of years, but the impact in terms of how it fucks us up is surprisingly stable. And I want to write that story. So it's going to be a very big kind of sweeping book. Just to the listeners out there, I asked Matt if he wanted to write that with me, and he said, absolutely not. Not my kind of, I don't want to do that at all. So here I am floundering on my own, but it's going to come out ideally from Basic Books in 2027. So I'm thick in the writing of it. It's honestly lots of fun.
I will say that the reason that I decided not to write the book with David is because I myself am not fucked up in any way. So I just decided that, it's just not for me.
You have to write what you know.
You have to write what you know. So, and it's just like, I'm the most normal person in the world, a medievalist living in Appalachia who's super interested in the 9th century. Like, everybody's like me, basically. But I think that's one of the things that's actually been very interesting in our collaboration, and to see that the different things that we can kind of bring to our collaborations, but also to see that the ways that our scholarship does take us sometimes, like, we are just interested in kind of different questions. The thing about the Man book is, or the
working title is Men, A History of a Bad Idea. We'll see whether that, everyone, it's not a secret. That's my working title. That may not be the title that appears on the cover, because really marketing gets to have a say. And I like to trust these professionals about like what's going to get people to pick up the book. I still think it's a good title though. And I do think there's a lot of bad ideas, and I'm mostly interested in the bad ideas, although there are some people with good ideas, or at least different ideas, that I want to talk about too. It's not all negative. Actually, there's a lot of people trying to do different things. Often they run into the problem of other men. So... Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that's so great about this particular idea is that there's so much conversation, obviously, not just in the U.S., but, elsewhere as well, is about the crisis of men, right?
Yeah.
The crisis of masculinity. And it's so ahistorical, and
Yeah.
it's like this isn't a problem that has never existed, that nobody's ever thought about kind of men before.
And at most, they go to like maybe the feminist movement of the mid-20th century or maybe back to the 1920s. But mostly it's like right now we have a problem. And I got to tell you, there's some history here, and you can't understand what's happening with anything without knowing the relevant history, or at least some relevant history.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I even like, we didn't really talk about this, but we do in Oathbreakers, for example, but like there's a lot of issues with kind of masculinity, especially kind of aristocratic masculinity, that gets played out not just within the family of the Carolingians themselves, the leaders, but at kind of every level, that leads to some really kind of terrible decisions, right?
Yeah.
Both about kind of sexual proclivities of aristocratic men, but also kind of the martial prowess of them, everybody trying to upstage one another, because that's how you kind of prove that you were kind of a good man. But then kind of other versions as well. You alluded to earlier this woman by the name of Duoda, this aristocratic woman who writes kind of a manual, a letter to her son who's being held hostage at a royal court, in which she kind of explains to him how to be a man, right?
Yeah. One of the pieces of history that's so important to me is that people recognize that there's this problem. It's not like just modern gender historians trying to impose this backwards. If you pick up the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's a piece of fiction, so it's constructed. There's a lot of sort of pondering about like, what does it mean to be a man? How can you do it better? Why do things fail? And again, it's a work of fiction based on we think a real person. But like, people in the past are often smart, not always, and think really hard about this and write it down and talk about it in ways that we can read and try to make sense of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the kind of joys of studying the past for me. And I think it could be any period, but I think the Middle Ages, especially, these people who are so far removed from you, from here in the United States, right? Like across an ocean and then separated by, at times, like nearly 2,000 years, or at least, 1,500 years or more sometimes. But there's a recognizability about them, not to say that they're exactly the same. And those differences are incredibly important, but that they were people back then. I always joke with my students that, and I don't know if they actually get the reference or not, but I like to make the joke because I'm a dad and I like to make dumb jokes in my classes. But, I think we think of the past, every past, as kind of those old timey movies of like Babe Ruth, where everything's black and white and moving too fast.
Yeah.
But, no, like things were in color, and like people made decisions, and they could have made otherwise, and they loved and they hated, and they, did all sorts of things that normal human beings do. And we need to recuperate that. Sometimes those things were really terrible and we need to pay attention to those, but we can understand them.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I'm working on is I write a newsletter with this guy I've mentioned before, Matt Gabriel at Modern Medieval, and I hope that people, you'll be able to find this podcast there. Periodically, Matt and I have things we want to say that don't fit in other formats, and we say them right there. It's a free newsletter, so check that out too.
It is a free newsletter. And Oathbreakers should be coming out in paperback. If it is not out by the time this podcast airs, it will be out very, very soon. If people want to learn more about your work, David, where can they find you?
I am most active on social media on Blue Sky, otherwise davidmperry.com.
And you can find our newsletter at buttondown.com/modernmedieval. But thank you so much for joining us. It is always fun to talk to an old friend, but especially to talk a little bit more about our book, which is, it's a weird thing, right? When you publish something, is that it's like out there in the world, you work on it so intensely for a while, and then it just kind of goes out there, and then people read it.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes they ask you questions about it.
And thank you. Thank you for reading it.
Yes, I did, actually. Yeah, I read at least most of it. So
I didn't mean you. I was talking to your listeners, but also you.
Oh, right. So again, like I'm the main character, so it's fine. So anyway. All right. Thank you again for joining us, David. I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and join us again sometime soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.